It is just past midnight on the 16th of July, 7-7-79. A British sentry stands on the southern shoulder of a rock called Stony Point, 150 feet above the Hudson River, and he is peering into a darkness so complete that the water and the sky have become the same black thing. Then the darkness moves. Shapes in the marsh below him. Not one or two, hundreds. Men, chest deep in the freezing tidal swamp, wading toward the base of his fortress in a silence that is somehow worse than any war cry he has ever heard. He brings his musket up. He fires. The shot cracks across the river. The alarm goes up. And here is the detail that should not make sense. The detail that every account of this night circles back to, because it is the whole story compressed into a single impossibility. The men in the water do not fire back. They cannot. Their muskets are empty, not jammed, not soaked. Empty by order. Every cartridge left behind in camp, every flint useless, because the general who sent them into that marsh had made a decision that no 18th century commander in his right mind was supposed to make. He had decided that his soldiers would attack the most heavily fortified position on the Hudson River. 15 heavy cannon, 2 rings of earthworks, walls of sharpened timber, 600 of the best professional soldiers in the British Empire. And they would do it without firing a shot. The loudest weapon on this peninsula tonight would be silence. The only steel that found a British throat would be the bayonet. Think about what that means. These men waded through chest-high black water, holding weapons they were forbidden to use. When the sentry fired and the alarm screamed and the British guns opened up, the Americans had no answer except to keep climbing. No volley to fire back. No covering fire. Just the blade and the dark and the slope. Less than half an hour. That is how long it took. About 25 minutes, start to finish. In that single half hour, the fortress the British called, with real affection and real confidence, their little Gibraltar, the position their own engineers swore was impregnable, fell completely into the hands of men the British Empire had spent 4 years dismissing as an undisciplined rabble. 600 professional troops captured or killed. A colonel's sword surrendered in the dark, and not a single American had stopped to load his musket. We tell the story of the American Revolution as a story of gunfire. Lexington and Concord, the volleys at Bunker Hill, the long, ragged exchanges of massed muskets that defined 18th century war. But the operation that frightened the British High Command most in the summer of 1779, the one that made them question whether they understood their enemy at all, was won by men who were ordered not to shoot. It was won in the dark, with cold steel. By a general the British thought they had already broken 2 years earlier on another night, in another field, with bayonets of their own. Battles are not always decided by who has more guns. Sometimes they are decided by who is willing to give up the gun entirely, by who can hold their nerve in the dark, by who has turned discipline itself into a weapon sharper than any blade. By the end of this video, you will understand 3 things in the record documents with unusual precision. First, how a single overlooked strip of beach, exposed only at low tide and confirmed by a spy disguised as a simpleton, unlocked a fortress that should never have fallen. Second, why the British commander's own competence, his quick, professional textbook reaction to the first sound of battle, was the exact mistake that destroyed him. And third, how the cold steel of one night in July became the blueprint for the charge that, 2 years later, would end the war and force the surrender of a British army at Yorktown. You will see the wound to the head that should have ended the assault and the 4 words that kept it moving. You will meet a spy who escaped capture by hiding naked in a freezing mill pond. and a general haunted by a massacre who spent 2 years sharpening his men for the moment he could answer it. You will watch a fortress full of artillery be taken by men who never loaded a gun. And you will learn why, a century later, Americans had to invent slaughtered dogs and screaming battle cries to make the true story dramatic enough. When the truth, the silent truth, was already more frightening than the legend. These men did not win because they had more soldiers. They won because they had less to lose and more discipline than anyone believed possible. They won with silence and steel, and a single word they were forbidden to speak until the walls were theirs. Before we step into the marsh with them, hit that subscribe button. These are the stories that get buried, and you keep them alive by being here. Now, let us go to Stony Point to understand why a handful of rebels would risk everything on a rock in the Hudson. You have to understand the trap that the summer of 1779 had become. By that summer, the War of Independence in the North had ground into something that looked less like a war and more like two exhausted men leaning against each other, neither able to land the blow that would end it. The momentum of the early years was gone. The decisive American victory at Saratoga in the autumn of 1777 had done two enormous things. It had secured the northern frontier, and it had brought France into the war as an open ally. That second consequence changed everything. With France in the fight, Britain was no longer suppressing a colonial rebellion in a single theater. It was fighting a global war across multiple oceans against a rival empire. And every soldier and every ship committed to North America was a soldier and a ship not defending British interests somewhere else in the world. London responded by tightening its grip and narrowing its ambitions. Lieutenant General Sir Henry Clinton, the British commander in North America, was directed to abandon the occupation of Philadelphia, pull his forces back into the defensible fortress of New York City, and from that base, to do the one thing that would actually win the war: force George Washington into a single, general, decisive battle. Destroy the Continental Army in open field combat, and the rebellion collapses with it. That was the whole British strategy in the North, distilled. Find Washington, make him stand and fight on British terms, crush him. Washington understood this perfectly, and he refused to give Clinton the battle he wanted. During the winter encampment of 1778 into 1779 at Middlebrook, New Jersey, Washington sat across from a committee of conference from the Continental Congress. And the conversation that took place there tells you everything about the kind of commander he had become. Congress, dreaming big, wanted grand offensives, perhaps an invasion of Canada, perhaps a strike toward the Niagara country. Washington gave them a cold, honest accounting instead. The army was not capable of any of it. His men lacked arms, they lacked uniforms, they lacked provisions. And worst of all, he was staring down a manpower crisis. Roughly 3,000 soldiers were due to walk home as their enlistments expired, and there was no guarantee of replacing them. So the strategy they settled on was not glory. It was survival. Active defense. The Continental Army would hold its ground, would continue the relentless training that Baron von Steuben had begun at Valley Forge, would preserve its strength, and would react to British moves rather than initiate reckless ones. Above all, it would guard the spine of the war in the North, the Hudson River Valley, and the great fortress at West Point that controlled it. Whoever held the Hudson could cut the new nation in half, severing New England from the rest. Washington would not let that happen. Clinton, frustrated by an enemy who would not cooperate by dying, designed a campaign to pull Washington out of the Highlands by force. In late May of 1779, He loaded somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 British, Loyalist, and Hessian troops onto ships and sailed 40 miles up the Hudson. His target was King's Ferry, a critical crossing, the southernmost reliable line of communication linking New England to the middle colonies, sitting just below West Point itself. Take King's Ferry, and you sever an artery of the American war effort. The crossing was guarded, barely, by 2 small outposts. On the eastern shore stood Fort Lafayette at Verplancks Point. On the western shore stood Stony Point. And in May of 1779, Stony Point was not yet a fortress at all. It was a rough, unfinished blockhouse held by roughly 40 American soldiers. When the British amphibious force landed on both banks on the 31st of May, those 40 men did the only sane thing. They set fire to their unfinished works and retreated north before they could be surrounded. The next day, the British dragged heavy artillery up the steep slopes of Stony Point, and from that commanding height, they hammered Fort Lafayette across the water until its small garrison, under Captain Thomas Armstrong, had no choice but to surrender. King's Ferry was cut, but Clinton was not finished. And the second phase of his plan reveals what he was really after. He detached Major General William Tryon with more than 2,000 men and sent them raiding into Connecticut. On the 5th of July, Tryon's force landed and began burning New Haven, coastal towns and villages, put to the torch. This was not random cruelty. It was strategy, and a cynical one. Clinton calculated that if he burned enough of the homes of the people Washington was sworn to protect, the political pressure would become unbearable. Washington would be forced to come down out of his mountains to defend the civilians. And the moment he left the highlands, Clinton would have his decisive battle in the open. Washington did not move. It is one of the most disciplined decisions of his career, and it cost him something to make it. He sent word for local militia to harass Tryon's raiders. He shifted his main army slightly to Smith's Cove, about 10 miles from Stony Point. Close enough to react to an opportunity, far enough to be safe from a trap. But he would not march the Continental Army out into the open to chase raiders, because he understood that the towns of Connecticut, however precious, were not worth the army. And the army was the Revolution. Lose the towns, and you can rebuild them. Lose the army, and there is nothing left to rebuild them with. Clinton's bluff failed. Without the reinforcements he had expected from Europe, with his supply lines stretched and his enemy refusing to take the bait, he eventually ordered the bulk of his force back down the Hudson toward New York. But he did not let go of his prize entirely. To keep a hand around the throat of the river, he left behind a strong, well-supplied, heavily armed garrison at Stony Point. The unfinished blockhouse the Americans had burned was about to become something else entirely. The British engineers went to work, and they built on that rock a fortress they believed could not be taken. They were about to find out what they had built it against. To call Stony Point a strong position is to understate it. It was, by the standards of its day, very nearly a perfect one. Picture the geography. The point is a massive rocky promontory that thrusts out a full half-mile into the deep, fast-moving water of the Hudson, rising sharply to a peak some 150 feet above the river. The upper slopes are mostly bare of trees, rough, hilly, broken ground strewn with enormous boulders. For a defender standing at the crest, that bare, rocky slope is a gift. Clear, sweeping fields of fire down every approach, with cover in the boulders, and the high ground always at your back. For an attacker, it is a nightmare. You would be climbing slowly over loose rock, fully exposed, into the muzzles of men firing down at you. But the slope was not even the point's greatest defense. The greatest defense was the water. On three sides, north, east, and south, Stony Point was simply surrounded by the Hudson. There was no approach from those directions that did not involve boats, and boats meant noise, time, and exposure. The only way in by land was from the west, across a narrow neck of ground that tied the rock to the mainland. And that neck, that single doorway, was bordered on both sides by wide tidal marshland. At high tide, the marsh flooded with 2 to 4 feet of water, and at that moment, Stony Point ceased to be a peninsula at all. It became an island. The one land route closed itself twice a day on nature's schedule, with no help from any defender. The British engineers who took over the site understood exactly what they had been handed, and they set about making it worse for anyone who might try to take it back. They were so satisfied with the result that they gave the place a nickname, the kind of nickname soldiers only give to a position they trust with their lives. Their Little Gibraltar. It was a comparison to the great rock fortress at the mouth of the Mediterranean, the symbol in the British military mind of a place that simply does not fall. That is what they thought they were standing on. What they built was not the kind of fortress you picture from a European siege. No high stone walls, no elegant geometric bastions of cut masonry. The terrain was too rugged, and the time too short for that. Instead, the British adapted to the rock, and they built in earth and timber. A deeply layered system of earthen redoubts, flèches, those V-shaped artillery emplacements that point their open angle back toward friendly lines, and threaded everywhere across the approaches, dense barriers of abatis. You need to understand the abatis, because it will matter enormously in the dark. An abatis was made by felling large trees, then sharpening their thickest branches into outward-facing spikes, and anchoring the trunks firmly into the ground so the whole tangle pointed its hardened points directly at the men who would have to come through it. It was the 18th century's barbed wire, and worse, because barbed wire does not run a man through. To get past an abatis under fire, you had to physically tear it apart. Hack the branches with axes, drag the trunks aside with your hands and arms exposed the entire time to the men shooting at you from a few yards away. Armies feared the abatis for good reason. The British laid out 2 distinct, overlapping rings of defense across the peninsula. The outer line sat near the base of the hill, positioned to guard the narrow landward neck and the causeway across it. It was held by a forward detachment of around 300 men and backed by 7 artillery pieces. Then, roughly 200 yards further up the slope, at the very crest of the hill, sat the inner line, a semi-enclosed fort that held the main body of the garrison and another 6 cannon, looking out over a sweeping view of the river and every low approach to it. An attacker who somehow broke the outer line would simply find himself at the bottom of a fresh killing slope, climbing toward a second, higher, stronger ring of guns. And the guns were the heart of it. For an outpost of this size, the artillery complement at Stony Point was enormous. 15 field pieces spread across the 2 lines. According to the engineering instructions for the position, this included heavy 24-pounders and 18-pounders, the kind of guns built to smash ships or shred massed infantry at range. 4 12-pounders, 6 6-pounders, a 3-pounder, a massive 10-inch mortar, an 8-inch howitzer, and smaller cohorn mortars designed to lob explosive shells in a high arc and drop them directly onto troops advancing through the low ground. That is a staggering density of firepower for a single rock. And it did not even count the river. The water approaches were watched over by a Royal Navy gunboat and the armed sloop Vulture, anchored in deep water, ready to rake any force crossing the causeway with enfilading fire from the flank. So here is the position, laid out plainly. A 150-foot rock surrounded by water on 3 sides, a single land approach guarded by marsh that floods twice a day, 2 overlapping rings of earthworks and artillery, walls of sharpened timber, 15 heavy guns, warships on the water, and 600 or more professional soldiers manning all of it. By every rule of 18th century warfare, attacking this place was not bold. It was suicide. And yet, Washington's officers, studying the fortress for weeks through spyglasses from the surrounding mountains, found one flaw. One. The dense wooden abbati built along the southern shore did not extend far enough into the river. At low tide, and only at low tide, a narrow strip of sandy beach was exposed along that southern waterline. A muddy, precarious corridor, just wide enough for men to wade through the shallows, slip around the end of the timber barrier, and bypass the most heavily defended part of the outer line entirely. It was a tiny weakness. A few feet of wet sand, available only at certain hours, in the dark, under the guns. To everyone else, would have looked like nothing. To Washington, it looked like a door. The man Clinton chose to hold this fortress was no fool, and that fact matters more than almost anything else in this story. Stony Point was not lost because it was commanded by an incompetent. It was lost because it was commanded by a good, professional, conventional officer who did exactly what his training told him to do. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Henry Johnson, and he was a career soldier to the core. Born in Dublin in 1748, Irish by birth and British by service, Johnson had climbed the army the long, hard way. He took an ensign's commission in the 28th Regiment of Foot in 1761, made lieutenant the next year, and captain the year after that, learning his trade in the brutal school of the 7 Years' War. He came to the American colonies as a major in 1775, and General William Howe himself singled Johnson out to command a provisional battalion of light infantry through the hard campaigns of 1776 to 1778. By October of 1778, he was lieutenant colonel of the 17th Regiment of Foot. This was a man who had been chosen repeatedly by his superiors, a man who knew how to handle elite troops. And sitting behind 2 rings of guns on his little Gibraltar, a man who felt an absolute, settled certainty that no collection of rebels on earth could take what he held. His garrison was worthy of the position. A capable mixed force of regulars, elite shock troops, and provincial loyalists. The numbers shifted a little with sickness and detached duty. But the order of battle gives a clear picture of what an attacker would be walking into. At the core stood the battalion companies of the 17th Regiment of Foot, Johnson's own command, the backbone of the garrison. Reinforcing them were 2 grenadier companies of the 71st Regiment of Foot. Fraser's Highlanders and grenadiers were not ordinary infantry. They were the Army's shock troops, traditionally the biggest and most aggressive men in a regiment, used for the hardest assaults and the most stubborn defenses. There was a company-strength detachment of the Loyal American Regiment, roughly 60 provincial loyalists fighting for the crown. And there was a composite Royal Artillery detachment, around 51 men, to serve those 15 heavy guns. All told, the garrison numbered around 600 regulars and provincials, a force designed and equipped to hold this position indefinitely. So this is the equation as it stood in mid-July of 1779. On the rock, a perfect natural fortress, doubled by professional engineering, packed with artillery, guarded by warships, and held by hundreds of disciplined regulars under a competent, confident veteran. Against it, eventually, Washington would send fewer men, with no heavy artillery of their own, with no navy, and, this is the part that still astonishes, with orders not to load their guns. Johnson was right to be confident. By every measure that an 18th century officer was trained to respect, his position was unassailable. His mistake was not arrogance, exactly. His mistake was that he was measuring the wrong things. He was counting guns and walls and tides. He was not counting the one thing that would actually come for him in the dark. A few hundred hand-picked men who had been trained for a year toward a single purpose, led by a general with a wound in his memory that he had been waiting 2 years to repay. The loss of King's Ferry was not just a tactical inconvenience. It was an open wound, and Washington felt it bleeding. Tryon's raiders were still burning their way through Connecticut. The Continental Congress was functionally bankrupt. The paper money was collapsing into worthlessness. Inflation was eating the war effort alive. And out in the country, ordinary support for a war that had dragged on for 4 years with no end in sight was beginning to sag under its own weight. Washington understood something that pure military men sometimes miss. The revolution did not only need to survive on the battlefield. It needed to be believed in. He needed a victory, not a skirmish, not a raid, but a clean, shocking, undeniable triumph that would seize the British command by the throat, force Clinton to recall Tryon's torchbearers, and remind every wavering American why they had started this in the first place. He needed a masterstroke, and to deliver it, he reached past the ordinary line regiments of the Continental Army for a brand new instrument, the Corps of Light Infantry. Light infantry, as a concept, was old. Across the armies of Europe, light troops were soldiers stripped of heavy gear and heavy formation, built for speed, for scouting, for skirmishing, for darting ahead of the main army and fighting in loose, fast, flexible order. What made the American Light Infantry of 1779 different was how it was assembled. It was not a standing regiment with its own long history. It was a temporary elite, a concentrated essence, drawn deliberately from across the whole army. Officers went through the line regiments and pulled out the best, the fittest, the most agile, the most disciplined men they could find, and gathered them into one corps. These were the soldiers you wanted at the very tip of the spear. Men who could move silently and fast, fight in the dark, and obey under pressure. And these hand-picked men were the product of the hardest training the Army had yet devised, the system Baron von Steuben had instilled. The Prussian drill master, who had remade the ragged survivors of Valley Forge into something resembling a professional army, had driven into them a standard of physical endurance, precision, and, crucially for what was coming, bayonet proficiency that by 1779 genuinely rivaled the best light battalions in Europe. This was the secret the British did not yet grasp. The men they still pictured as farmers with fowling pieces, men who could snipe from behind a stone wall but would shatter in a stand-up fight, had been quietly transformed. They could now do the one thing British officers were certain Americans could not: meet British regulars at close quarters, with cold steel, and win. Washington organized the 1779 Corps, formed only that June, a month before the battle, as a brigade of 4 regiments, each drawing its elite companies from across the colonies. The 1st Regiment, under Colonel Christian Febiger, combined 6 companies of Virginians with 2 of Pennsylvanians. The 2nd Regiment, under Colonel Richard Butler, mixed 4 companies of Pennsylvanians with 4 of Marylanders. The 3rd Regiment, under Colonel Returned Jonathan Meigs, was 8 companies of Connecticut men. And the 4th Regiment, under Major William Hull, brought together 6 companies of Massachusetts troops and 2 from North Carolina. All told, the Corps numbered somewhere between 1,150 and 1,350 men. Not a large force, but every man in it had been chosen, and every man in it had been sharpened to an edge. This was the weapon. Now Washington needed the hand that could swing it, and he chose a man whose entire being had been bent toward this exact kind of fight by a night of horror 2 years before. The general Washington selected to lead the light infantry was 34 years old, a Pennsylvanian, and possessed of a reputation for aggression that no other officer in the Continental Command could match. His name was Brigadier General Anthony Wayne, and history would remember him by the nickname his temperament earned him, Mad Anthony. He was a fiery, exacting disciplinarian, a man who demanded perfection from his troops and gave no quarter to sloppiness, and who, when the fighting came, habitually placed himself at the front of it. He had built his name the hard way. At the Battle of Brandywine and again at Monmouth, Wayne had shown the one quality that an army on the back foot prizes above all others. He would hold. He would stand against superior British numbers and not break. If you wanted a position taken or a line held by sheer force of will, Anthony Wayne was the officer you sent. But Wayne carried something the rest of his record does not explain. He carried a wound that did not show. And to understand Stony Point, to understand why this particular general attacked this particular fortress with this particular ferocity, you have to go back to a tavern in Pennsylvania 2 years earlier, on a night Wayne could never put down. In September of 1777, after Brandywine, Wayne's forces were encamped near the Paoli Tavern. In the middle of the night, a British force under Major General Charles Grey came for them. And Grey did something that night that would scar the American memory for a generation. To guarantee perfect silence, to make sure not one nervous soldier could fire a musket and give the attack away, Grey ordered his men to remove the flints from their weapons entirely. No flints meant no firing. It meant the British would come in total silence and kill entirely with the bayonet. They fell on the sleeping, half-waking American camp in the dark, and they used the steel. More than 200 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured in the chaos and the screaming. The great majority of them taken prisoner, with somewhere around 50 killed outright. Whatever the precise tally, the night burned itself into the American memory under a name that needed no explanation: the Paoli Massacre. Later historians would argue the massacre label owed as much to patriot propaganda as to the body count. But to the men who lived through it, and to Wayne, it was simply the night the bayonet came for them in the dark. Wayne survived it. But it never left him. Some men are broken by a thing like that. Wayne was sharpened by it. The trauma of Paoli became an obsession, and the obsession became a discipline, an absolute fixation on operational security, on silence, on secrecy, and above all, on the tactical mastery of the very weapon that had humiliated and slaughtered his men in the dark. He understood something hard and clear. The bayonet had been used against Americans because the British believed Americans could not use it back. To beat the British, Americans would have to take that weapon. The silent weapon, the night weapon, the weapon of Paoli, and become better with it than the men who had taught them its terror. So when Washington proposed a surprise night assault on Stony Point, the symmetry would not have been lost on Wayne. Here was a chance to take the exact tactics that had been used to butcher his men in their sleep: the removed flints, the total silence, the reliance on the bayonet in the dark, and turn them against a British garrison. It is worth being careful here, because this is exactly where history blurs into legend. Wayne was not, in fact, ordered to take Stony Point as revenge for Paoli. The assignment was strategic, not personal. And the famous picture of his men screaming, "Remember Paoli," as they charged is, as we will see, very likely a later invention. The connection was real, but it lived in resonance and in Wayne's own memory, not in his orders. Still, the echo is unmistakable. Paoli had been done to Americans with the silent bayonet. Stony Point would be answered the same way. This is why the controlling decision of the entire battle, to attack with unloaded muskets, in silence, with the bayonet, would not have felt strange to Anthony Wayne at all. He had been on the receiving end of exactly that, in the dark, 2 years before. He knew, better than almost anyone alive, how well it worked. A fortress like Stony Point cannot be taken by courage alone. Courage gets men killed on the abatis. What takes a fortress like Stony Point is knowledge, exact, patient, dangerous knowledge, and the plan built on top of it. And the planning for this assault was a masterpiece of intelligence work, layered, careful, and obsessed above all else with one thing: secrecy. The problem was stark. The British works were far too strong for a small American detachment to besiege in the ordinary way. And the Continental Army had no heavy siege artillery to batter the earthworks down, even if it had wanted to. There would be no slow, methodical reduction of this place. Victory depended entirely on finding a weakness and exploiting it with total, absolute surprise. To do that, Washington needed to know everything. The layout of the redoubts, the placement of every gun, the lines of the abatis, the routine of the sentries, and most of all, whether that rumored strip of beach on the southern shore was real. Washington threw himself into the reconnaissance personally. For weeks, spyglass in hand, he climbed the commanding heights of the nearby Buckberg and Dunderberg mountains and studied the British position across the distance, mapping the redoubts he could see and tracing the visible lines of abatis. It was good work, but it had a limit, and Washington knew it. From a mountaintop a mile or more away, you can map what faces you. You cannot see the routine of a sentry's walk. You cannot read a watchword, and you cannot confirm whether a wooden barrier reaches all the way into the water or stops a few yards short at low tide. For that, someone had to go inside. That someone was Captain Alan McLean, and McLean was the kind of man whose real exploits sound like tall tales. He was a cavalryman and a spy master, famous through the Army for daring raids, narrow escapes, and a network of human intelligence that reached deep into British territory. He had commanded a partisan band of dragoons around Philadelphia, so effective at cutting British supply lines that they had earned a nickname of their own: the Market Stoppers. McLean was utterly at home behind enemy lines. By his own later account, when he was once caught and forced into a dismounted, hand-to-hand fight against several British dragoons at once, he escaped by stripping off his clothes and submerging himself in a freezing mill pond, lying there in the cold water until his pursuers finally gave up and rode away. That was the man Washington needed to walk into Stony Point and walk back out. McLean's method, as the story has come down to us, was as audacious as the man. He could not simply sneak in past the sentries, not with the kind of detail Washington needed, which required moving around inside the works in daylight. So he did not sneak. He walked in through the front, in disguise, hiding in plain sight. He took on the character of a simple-minded, rustic farmer, harmless, dull, beneath notice. And he attached himself to a local woman who had business inside the fort. Her cover story was real and unremarkable. She was going in to visit her son, a loyalist who had recently come over to the British garrison. McLean played the slow country escort, and the British waved them both through. And then, for as long as he could stretch the visit, McLean's trained military eye did its work. He moved through the perimeter, memorizing what no spyglass could ever capture: the placement of the sentry posts, the garrison's routines, when men were alert, when they were slack, the watchwords, the exact sighting of the guns, and the prize above all prizes, the thing the whole assault would hinge upon. He confirmed it with his own eyes. The southern abatis did not run into the deep water. At low tide, that strip of beach was open. The door was real. McLean walked back out of Stony Point, carrying in his head the key to the fortress. Armed with McLean's intelligence and his own weeks of observation, Washington drafted the assault plan and sent his detailed confidential instructions to Wayne in early July of 1779. And those instructions reveal a mind thinking on two levels at once: the level of 18th century tactics and the deeper level of human psychology. The orders were these: the assault would be made by the light infantry alone. It would go in under the absolute cover of night. And this was the heart of it, the decision that defined everything. The attacking columns would advance with completely unloaded muskets. Washington's reasoning was precise and merciless in its logic. A single nervous soldier in the dark with a loaded gun might flinch and fire at a shadow. That one shot would wake the garrison and throw away the only advantage the Americans had: surprise. So Washington removed the possibility entirely. Empty the guns. Pull the threat of the accidental shot out of the equation by force. The men would carry their muskets, but they would fight with fixed bayonets and with spontoons, the polearms carried by officers, and with nothing else. Secrecy is so much more essential to these kinds of enterprises than numbers, Washington wrote. And in that one line is the entire philosophy of the battle. Not firepower, not mass. Silence and shock and the blade. Wayne, who had been waiting 2 years to hear an order exactly like this one, took Washington's doctrine and built a tactical plan around the terrain. He divided his force of roughly 1,350 men into 3 columns, each with a distinct and synchronized role. The right-hand column, the southern column, was the main effort, and Wayne would lead it himself. This was the hammer. The 1st and 3rd regiments, together with Hull's Massachusetts detachment, around 1,000 men in all. Their task was the one McLean had unlocked: wade through the southern tidal marsh at low tide, slip around the incomplete abatis along that narrow beachhead, and scale the steepest, least defended part of the southern cliffs, coming up where the British least expected an army. The left-hand column, the northern column, was under Colonel Richard Butler. The 2nd Regiment, around 300 men. They would cross the northern marsh and strike the opposite flank of the British defenses, hitting at the same instant as Wayne's column, so that the garrison would be assaulted on both flanks simultaneously and unable to concentrate against either. And the center column was the masterstroke within the masterstroke. Under Major Hardy Murphy, this smaller force would position itself at the narrow causeway, directly facing the strongest part of the British center. And alone among the 3 columns, Murphy's men were ordered to load their weapons. Their job was not to break through. Their job was to lie. They were to advance openly and open up a heavy, sustained, noisy fire straight at the British front. To look and sound exactly like a conventional, massed, head-on assault across the land bridge. It was a feint, a deliberate piece of theater designed to seize the attention and the reserves of the British command and drag them toward the center, away from the flanks where the real attack was climbing the rocks in silence. To deal with the abatis themselves, Wayne organized specialized vanguards for the 2 silent columns. These detachments, 100 to 150 men each, were armed with axes and picks, and their job was to hack open pathways through the sharpened timber while the enemy shot at them. And at the very front of each vanguard, ahead even of the axemen, marched the most chilling element of the whole plan: 20 volunteers, a forlorn hope, a term of art for a detachment so exposed that its members were not expected to survive. Their entire purpose was to be first into the breach, to absorb the opening blast of grape shot and musketry with their own bodies, and to clear the way for the men behind them. 20 men, north and south, who stepped forward knowing the math. The plan was complete. Silence on the flanks, noise in the center. Empty guns and fixed steel. A door of wet sand opened by a spy in a farmer's clothes. Now it had to be carried 14 miles through the dark, on foot, without one man being seen. The operation began at noon on the 15th of July, and from its first hour, it was an exercise in discipline pushed to the edge of cruelty, because everything, every life involved, depended on no one knowing they were coming. The Corps of Light Infantry mustered at Sandy Beach, north of the ruins of the old American fortifications at Fort Montgomery. Ahead of them lay a march of 14 miles, and Wayne had chosen the route not for speed, but for secrecy. They would not take the established roads. They abandoned the easy thoroughfares entirely, and instead threaded their way along treacherous, neglected mountain paths. Much of it in single file, one man behind another, snaking westward through Queensboro and up over the rugged heights of Dunderberg Mountain. It was a grueling, exhausting passage, deliberately so. Every hard mile of broken trail was a mile where no British scout, no loyalist farmer, would happen to see a column of 1,000 men on the move. And Wayne took no chances with the people along the way. He issued strict orders that any civilian the column encountered was to be detained. Captain James Christie of the 3rd Pennsylvania Regiment was given the specific task of taking and holding all the male inhabitants in the vicinity of the enemy's lines until further orders. It sounds harsh, and it was. But the logic was airtight. A single loyalist sympathizer, slipping away to carry word to Colonel Johnson, would turn the assault from a surprise into a slaughter. An American slaughter on the Abati, in the dark. So no one who saw them was allowed to leave. The column moved sealed inside its own silence. By 8 o'clock that evening, exhausted but intact, the troops reached Springsteel's farm, a staging area about 1.5 miles west of the Stony Point works. And it was only here, only now, at this isolated farm in the gathering dark, that the enlisted men were finally told what they had been marching toward. Most of them, until this moment, had no idea they were about to assault Little Gibraltar. The secrecy had been kept even from the men who would die for it. By 10 o'clock, Wayne formed his men into their assault columns. To steady nerves stretched tight by the news and the dark and the waiting, he issued a ration of rum. And then he gave his final orders, and they were as uncompromising as the man who gave them. First, the problem of the dark itself. In a night melee, with men struggling hand to hand, and visibility near zero, how do you tell friend from enemy? Wayne's solution was crude and brilliant. Every man would pin a piece of white paper to his hat, a small pale patch, just visible in the gloom, that meant American. It was the 18th century answer to a 1,000-year-old problem, and it would save lives in the chaos to come. Second, the watchword. Wayne gave them the phrase that would mark the victory. The fort's our own. But he bound it with an iron condition. The men were to maintain absolute, breathless silence throughout the entire approach and assault. And they were forbidden, strictly, on pain of death, from shouting that watchword until the inner works had actually been breached. The cry was not a battle chant. It was a signal, and it meant only one thing. We are inside. The fort is taken. To shout it early was to lie in a way that could unravel the whole attack. And then the hardest order of all, the one that tells you exactly how seriously Wayne and Washington took the silence. Any soldier who broke ranks, who turned to retreat, or who attempted to load his musket during the silent advance, was to be put to death on the spot by the nearest officer, not court-martialed later. Killed then and there to preserve the surprise. Wayne was telling his men that the silence was worth more than any single one of their lives, including, as it would turn out, very nearly his own. At 11:30 that night, the columns split apart and moved out toward their jump-off points at the edges of the marshes. And an hour before that, Wayne had done something that reveals how clearly he understood the odds he was about to face. He had gone alone into his tent and written a letter, a solemn, almost final letter, to his friend Delaney, asking him to look after his children. "This will not reach you until the writer is no more," Wayne wrote. "I am called to sup, but where to breakfast? Either within the enemy's lines in triumph or in another world." He sealed it, and he went out into the dark to lead the column. He fully expected to die on that rock. He went anyway. Nature chose that night to take the American side. As the columns crept toward the marshes, the weather turned in their favor in a way no commander could have ordered. High winds swept down the Hudson Valley, and a heavy cloud cover rolled in and smothered the moon, dropping the peninsula into a darkness so deep it was nearly absolute. That was gift enough. But the wind gave them more. The harsh weather forced the British naval vessels anchored in Haverstraw Bay. The gunboat and the armed sloop Vulture, whose heavy guns could have raked the causeway and the marshes and torn the attacking columns to pieces, to abandon their stations off Stony Point and move downriver to safer anchorage. In one stroke, the weather lifted much of the threat of British naval gunfire off the attack. The most dangerous obstacle to a force crossing that water had drifted away into the dark. At exactly midnight, the synchronized assault began. And almost immediately, Wayne's plan collided with the one thing no plan can fully control: the ground itself. The intelligence had said low tide, but the tide had not fully receded as expected, and Wayne's massive right column waded into a southern marsh that was not the muddy strip of beach they had been promised. It was a swamp, flooded with 2 to 4 feet of frigid water. There was nothing to do but go through it. So 1,000 men walked into the cold, black water, chest deep in places, holding their unloaded muskets and useless powder up above their heads to keep them dry. Though they had no intention of ever firing them, the discipline held even there. The crossing was agonizing. Slow, silent, freezing, each step sucking at the mud. It took the better part of 30 minutes to wade through the muck and reach the first line of abatis on the far shore. 30 minutes in the open water, under a fortress full of guns, trusting entirely to the dark and the wind and the silence. And then the silence broke as the vanguard reached the opposite shore and began to pick its way across the narrow beachhead. A British sentry on the southern works peered down into the gloom and saw the movement. The great dark mass of men coming up out of the water. He raised his weapon and he fired. The crack of that single musket shattered the night, and an instant later it was answered by the roar of the British alarm and the first rolling volleys of defensive fire pouring down off the heights. The element of total stealth was gone. The men in the water were now lit by muzzle flashes, exposed and still forbidden to fire back. Everything now depended on whether the rest of Wayne's intricate machine would hold together in the chaos or fall apart. It held. The moment the firing erupted on the southern flank, the plan's deception clicked into motion exactly as designed. Down at the causeway, in the center, Major Hardy Murphy heard the gunfire erupt on the southern flank. And that was his signal. His men, the only Americans on the field with loaded muskets, opened up. It was a magnificent piece of theater. Murfree's column unleashed a deafening, continuous, rolling volley of musketry straight into the British front lines along the land bridge. Flash after flash after flash, the steady hammering rhythm of a massed infantry assault, the unmistakable sound and fury of an army trying to force its way across the narrow neck head-on. To anyone listening inside that fort in the dark, and Colonel Henry Johnson was listening, it sounded exactly like what 18th century doctrine said an attack on Stony Point should sound like. A frontal assault on the causeway, the obvious approach, the only sane one. And here, Johnson did the thing that destroyed him. He did not panic. He did not freeze. He reacted like the competent professional officer he had spent 18 years becoming. He read the battlefield as his training had taught him to read it. Heavy, sustained fire from the front meant the main attack was coming from the front. And he responded decisively and fast. He committed a large part of his garrison, by several accounts, something close to half of it, forward toward the causeway and the outer works to break the assault he believed was massing against his center. His men and his attention surged toward the noise, and away from the silent flanks where the real columns were already on the rocks. It was the textbook move. It was also the single worst decision he could possibly have made. And it was the exact decision Washington and Wayne had built their entire plan to provoke. Murfree's loud, costly, deliberately deceptive fire had done precisely its job. It had reached into the mind of a good commander and pulled him in exactly the wrong direction. By rushing the bulk of his men down to the front to meet a phantom, Johnson stripped the inner fort, the real prize, the crest of the hill, of its primary defenders, and he laid his own flanks bare to the two silent columns that were, at that very moment, clawing their way up the rocks to either side of him. This is the cruel center of the whole story. Stony Point did not fall because its commander was a fool. It fell because its commander was good, and the Americans had designed a trap that turned his competence into the weapon that beat him. He did everything right according to the rules. The Americans had simply changed the rules, in the dark, without telling him. While the British center chased Murfree's lie, the real battle was happening on the flanks, in near total silence, on the slopes. And it was savage. Wayne's southern column and Butler's northern column surged up the precipitous, rocky cliffs on either side of the fort. The British artillerymen, realizing too late where the danger was, fought desperately to bring their guns to bear, trying to depress the heavy barrels far enough to fire grape shot down into the climbing mass of attackers. But the terrain defeated them. The slope was too steep, the angle too sharp, and the Americans were moving too fast, swarming up underneath the downward arc of the cannon, into the dead ground where the big guns simply could not reach them. The 15 heavy pieces that had made Stony Point a fortress were, in those critical minutes, very nearly useless. By one British account, of all 15 guns, only 2 managed to fire at all that night, and one of those to no effect. The defenders' greatest strength had become irrelevant the moment the attack came from a direction the guns could not answer. But the abatis could still kill, and it did. At the tangled walls of sharpened timber, the vanguard's axemen threw themselves at the wood under a hail of close-range musket fire. They hacked and tore and dragged at the branches, fully exposed, trying to rip open a path for the columns behind them. And out in front of them, the forlorn hopes paid the price they had volunteered to pay. Each column was led by one of these 20-man suicide details under Lieutenant James Gibbons and Lieutenant George Knox, whose job was to be first, to absorb the worst of it, to clear the way with their bodies if it came to that. And it came to that. Of the 20 men in Gibbons' forlorn hope, 17 were killed or wounded in the opening barrage. 17 of 20. They had known the math when they stepped forward, and the math was honored in full. Among the men in the assault was a figure who would later half-pass into legend, Peter Francisco, the Virginia Giant. Here, the record and the folklore have to be pulled apart carefully, because Francisco's story grew enormously in the retelling. What the documents actually support is this. The muster rolls place him in the corps of light infantry. He himself later testified that he served in one of the Forlorn Hopes, and he carried off the Rock a savage wound. A bayonet gash some 9 inches long across his abdomen, described in his own pension applications. That much is solid, and it is remarkable enough on its own. An immense man clawing at the abatis and climbing that slope with a wound like that. The rest of the famous Francisco legend, a duel at the flagstaff, 3 redcoats cut down by his hand, the colors seized by his own grip, comes from his later accounts and the stories that gathered around him, not from the reports the officers wrote in the days after the battle. We will come back to him. For now, the documented core is enough. He was there, he bled for it, and he kept moving. And then the moment that should have ended everything. As General Wayne personally led the main body of the right column through the shattered abattis, leading from the front, as he always did, as Paoli had taught him he must. A British musket ball struck him squarely in the head. He went down hard, blood sheeting over his face, dazed and certain, in that instant, that the wound was mortal. This was the moment the entire assault hung on. A column that sees its general fall in the dark, at the foot of the enemy's last wall, can lose its nerve in a heartbeat. Confusion, hesitation, the collapse of will, and the whole thing dies on the abatis, and the men in the water have crossed it for nothing. Wayne did not let that happen. Bleeding, half blind, convinced he was dying, he refused to be carried to the rear. Instead, he rose to his knees, drew his sword, and gave the order that turned a potential disaster into the hinge of victory. "March on, boys," he said. "Carry me into the fort. For should the wound be mortal, I will die at the head of the column. Carry me forward. If I die going in." Command passed temporarily to Colonel Febigere as Wayne's aides lifted their wounded general and bore him up the slope. And the sight of him, bloodied, sword in hand, demanding to be carried into the fight rather than out of it, did not break the light infantry. It detonated them. Driven by the image of a general who would rather die advancing than live retreating, the men swept over the earthworks with a speed that nothing on that rock could stop. And inside the works, the silence finally had its reckoning. The combat became a brutal, claustrophobic, close-quarters slaughter fought entirely with cold steel. The Americans, holding to Washington's orders even now, in the chaos, did not stop to load. They had crossed a swamp without firing. They had climbed a cliff without firing. And now they took the fort the same way, with the bayonet and the spontoon and nothing else. The empty muskets that had seemed like madness in the planning had become exactly what Washington intended. A discipline so total that it carried men through a flooded marsh, up a defended cliff, and into a fortress, without a single one of them breaking to do the instinctive, fatal thing and fire into the dark. Paoli had been answered, and it had been answered in the same currency: silence, darkness, and the blade. There is a single image that the night condenses into, and it belongs to a Frenchman. Lieutenant Colonel François de Fleury was a French engineer serving in the Continental Army, and he commanded the vanguard of Wayne's right column, the men at the very tip of the southern spear. Fleury was the first man to vault over the parapet into the inner works of the fort. First, over the wall, into the heart of Little Gibraltar, ahead of every other American on the field. And he went straight for the thing that mattered most in the symbolic grammar of 18th century war: the flag. He fought his way to the flagstaff, hauled down the British colors with his own hands, and then, only now, with the inner works breached, with the condition Wayne had set finally met, he roared the watchword up into the night. "The fort's our own!" That cry meant everything. It was the signal the whole Corps had been forbidden to speak until this exact moment. And now it tore across the rock, telling every American struggling in the dark that the impossible thing had happened. They were inside. The colors were down. The fort was theirs. The order in which the men crossed that parapet was recorded with unusual care, because Wayne had promised cash bounties to the first soldiers into the works. $500 to the first, then $400, $300, and so on down. By that record, Fleury was first, and the second man over the wall, right behind him, was Lieutenant George Knox, followed by 3 sergeants, Baker, Spencer, and Dunlop. For Colonel Henry Johnson, the watchword was the sound of his world inverting. He was down at the outer line, where his own competence had sent him, pressing against Murfree's phantom assault. And now he heard it, behind him, up the hill, where his fort and his guns and the bulk of his garrison's defensive strength were supposed to be. The fort's our own. Behind him, he understood, in that instant, the full shape of what had been done to him. He had been completely outflanked. The frontal attack had been a lie, and while he chased it, the real army had come up the cliffs on both sides and taken the crest he had abandoned. He tried to fix it. Johnson attempted to fight his way back up the hill from the outer line toward the inner redoubt to retake the heart of his own fortress. He never made it. He was cut off, surrounded by the bayonets of Colonel Febiguer's regiment, and forced to surrender his sword. On the eastern side of the hill, Colonel Meggs's regiment overwhelmed the Loyalist detachment of the Loyal American Regiment. And that was it. Less than half an hour. From the first shot of that startled British sentry to the surrender of the garrison commander, barely 25 minutes had passed. It was over by 1 in the morning. In that single span, the impregnable little Gibraltar, the rock the British Empire had trusted to hold the Hudson, 15 heavy guns, 2 rings of earthworks, hundreds of professional soldiers, all of it, had fallen completely, totally, into American hands. Taken in the dark, taken in near silence, taken by men who, almost to the last, had never loaded a musket. And here the story does something that elevates it from a brilliant raid into something larger. Something about the kind of army the Continentals had decided to be. Remember Paoli? Remember that 2 years earlier, British troops under General Gray had bayoneted surrendering Americans in the dark, had given no quarter, had answered cries for mercy with the blade. The men who took Stony Point had not forgotten. Many of them carried that memory personally, and the British garrison knew it. As the fort fell and the Americans poured over them with the bayonet, the surviving British soldiers fully expected to be slaughtered. They expected Paoli returned to them with interest. By the brutal logic of the war they had been fighting, they had every reason to. It did not come. The moment the British threw down their arms and begged for quarter, the killing stopped, not gradually, immediately. The American Light Infantry? These men keyed up to a killing pitch, soaked and freezing and bleeding, many of them survivors of a massacre, holding in their hands the exact weapon that had massacred their friends. These men lowered the steel the instant the enemy surrendered. Not one British soldier was put to death after laying down his arms. Not one. The British themselves recorded it, and they recorded it with something close to disbelief. Contemporary British reports noted that the rebels showed at this moment a generosity and clemency which during the course of the rebellion had no parallel. read that again, because it is being said by the losing side, about the men who had just stormed their fort in the dark. No parallel. Nothing like it in the whole war. This was discipline of a different order than the tactical kind. It would have been so easy, so understandable, so human, to take revenge. The opportunity was total. The provocation was years deep. The darkness would have hidden it. And the Americans chose not to. Partly, it was Wayne's iron control over his corps. Partly, it was a deliberate decision, because Washington understood that mercy here was also a weapon. Proof broadcast to the British command and to the watching courts of Europe that the Continental Army was not a mob of vengeful rebels, but a professional force that fought with honor as well as with steel. An army that could win like this and then show mercy like this was an army to be reckoned with and recognized. They had answered Paoli on the slope with the bayonet. They refused to answer it inside the walls with murder. Both choices, the violence and the restraint, came from the same place. Men who had decided exactly who they were going to be. When the sun came up on the 16th of July, the numbers told the story of just how lopsided the night had been. The American Light Infantry, the attacking force, the side that by every rule should have been butchered against those defenses, had lost 15 men killed and 83 wounded, 98 casualties out of more than 1,000 who made the assault. For storming a fortress of that strength, across a flooded marsh, up a defended cliff, through walls of sharpened timber, those are astonishingly light losses. And they are a direct measure of how completely surprise and speed had done their work. A great many of those casualties, it should be said, fell in the forlorn hopes and the vanguards. The men who went first paid most of the bill. The British garrison, by contrast, was simply erased as a fighting force. According to the British return, about 20 of his men were killed in the close fighting. Some 74 were wounded, and 58 were listed as missing. A grim category that, on this particular battlefield, mostly meant men who had drowned trying to flee through the same dark marsh the Americans had just waded in. And then the figure that defined the victory. 472 unwounded men taken prisoner. The entire surviving garrison captured intact, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Johnson among them. A complete professional garrison of a major fortress gone in half an hour. Most of it marched off into captivity. As dawn broke, a wounded but triumphant Wayne dictated his report to Washington, and he kept it short, because the news did not need decoration. "The fort and garrison with Colonel Johnson are ours," he wrote. "Our officers and men behaved like men who are determined to be free." Men who are determined to be free. That was the whole argument of the Revolution, written in one line by a man with a bullet wound in his scalp, standing in a fort he had just taken from the British Empire in the dark. Washington himself rode into the captured works the next day, the 17th, to survey the victory with his own eyes, inspect the ground, and congratulate his troops. And the Americans collected the spoils, which were considerable. They captured all 15 of the valuable artillery pieces and a trove of military stores valued at a staggering $150,000, a fortune to a bankrupt army. Congress, starved for good news, was ecstatic. They voted formal thanks to Washington and to Wayne, struck a Congressional Gold Medal for Wayne, one of only a handful awarded in the entire war, and silver medals for Lieutenant Colonel de Fleury and Major John Stewart, the two officers who had led the vanguards of the attacking columns. And, in a gesture borrowed from the rules of naval prize money, Congress distributed the value of the captured stores among the light infantry, real money in the hands of the men who had earned it with their bodies. Congress also honored Wayne's pre-battle pledges to the first men into the fort. $500 went to de Fleury for being first over the wall, and Fleury, in a gesture worthy of the man, asked that the money go to his soldiers instead. And then Washington did something that reveals the difference between a tactician and a strategist. Having taken the impossible fortress, he gave it up. He understood the geography with the same clarity he had brought to everything else. Stony Point was a magnificent prize and an impossible keep. The Continental Army had no navy. The Royal Navy could simply return, surround that isolated rock, anchor in the deep water, and bombard the position into rubble at its leisure. And this time, the Americans would be the ones trapped on the peninsula with no way off. Holding it would mean losing the very light infantry that had just taken it. So Washington refused to be seduced by his own victory. He ordered the fortifications systematically dismantled, the stores and the guns hauled away, and the site abandoned. The American forces withdrew on the 18th of July, 2 days after they had bled to take the place. On the 19th, the British came back and reoccupied the ruins, and in time, they rebuilt the fort. On a map, it can look as though nothing had changed. The British held Stony Point in July, and the British held Stony Point again by the end of July. But that map lies, because the real damage had already been done, and it could not be undone by reoccupying a rock. Clinton's grand summer offensive was finished. The shock of Stony Point, the demonstration that his strongest position on the river could be taken in half an hour by an enemy he had dismissed, paralyzed his campaign. He no longer had the manpower or the confidence to hold the Hudson Highlands aggressively, while also fending off a Continental Army that had just proven it could do this. And under pressure to send forces south to a new theater of the war, Clinton made the decision that was the true measure of the victory. In October of 1779, he permanently abandoned both Stony Point and Verplancks Point. He gave up King's Ferry. He gave up the entire object of his summer campaign. The Americans had stormed a fortress, held it for 3 days, walked away from it, and still won the campaign, because the thing they had really destroyed was never the rock. It was the British belief that the rock could not be taken. War remembers fortresses and forgets the men who took them, or held them, or lost them. So before the legend swallows the people, it is worth following a few of them out the far side of that night. Take the loser first, because his fate is the most surprising. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Johnson, having surrendered his sword in the dark, was eventually exchanged and returned to British lines. And he did something that tells you he believed in his own conduct. He requested a court-martial. He demanded to be formally tried for the loss of Stony Point, to answer the accusation that he had failed to defend it adequately. And at that trial, in New York City, he made exactly the argument the facts supported, that he had been overwhelmed by a vastly superior, superbly disciplined force executing a flawless surprise assault in complete darkness, against which no reasonable defense could have held. The tribunal agreed. Johnson was acquitted, cleared of blame for the loss, and his career did not merely survive the disaster, it flourished. He was exchanged, resumed command of the 17th, and served on under Lord Cornwallis in Virginia and the Carolinas through to the surrender at Yorktown. After the war, he rose steadily. In 1798, during the Irish Rebellion, he commanded 3,000 men and beat back a far larger rebel force at the Battle of New Ross, reckoned the hardest single fight of that rising. He ended his career a full general, and in 1818 was created a baronet. The man who lost little Gibraltar in half an hour died honored at Bath at the age of 87. History, it turns out, did not punish Henry Johnson nearly as much as that one July night must have. The spy, Alan McLean, who had walked into the fort disguised as a fool and walked out with its secret, continued his improbable career of daring and survival in the American service. The Frenchman Fleury, first over the wall, took his $500 and gave it to his men. Peter Francisco, the Virginia giant, survived his 9-inch wound, survived, in fact, an entire war's worth of wounds, and lived to become exactly the kind of figure folklore loves, which is precisely why later generations could not resist improving on a truth that was already remarkable. We will come back to him, because his story is a small case study in how legends grow over facts. And Wayne himself, the bleeding general who demanded to be carried into the fort to die at the head of his column, he did not die. The head wound was real, but not mortal. The ball had cut his scalp and stunned him, not killed him. He carried the victory of Stony Point and the Congressional Gold Medal for the rest of a long and turbulent military career. And mad, Anthony Wayne went on to fight again and again for the country he had bled for on that rock. The ghost of Paoli, the wound that did not show, had finally been given its answer. Whether it ever truly let him go, only Wayne could have said. But notice the pattern, because it is the pattern of all war. The men we can follow are the officers, the commanders, the named: Johnson, Wayne, Fleury, McLean. The 17 men of Gibbon's forlorn hope who fell on the abatis so the column could pass. The men who drowned in the Black Marsh trying to flee. The ordinary soldiers of the 17th Foot marched off into captivity. Most of them are gone into the silence, names unrecorded, lives summed up as a number in an after-action report. 15 killed, 83 wounded. Each of those numbers was a man with a face and a fear and a reason to be standing in that freezing water at midnight. War celebrates the plan and the general. It buries the man who carried out the plan and made the general great. Stony Point is no different, except that here, the burial happened twice. Once in fact, and once in legend, as the 19th century set about replacing the real men with invented ones. Step back from the noise and the blood for a moment and look at the assault the way a military instructor looks at it. Because Stony Point is taught, deliberately, in the study of how a weaker force defeats a stronger one. Strip away the drama, and you find 5 principles interlocking so cleanly that the whole operation reads almost like a proof. Each one, on its own, is ordinary. The genius was in stacking all 5 on a single night. The first principle is the one Washington wrote down himself. Surprise is worth more than numbers. Secrecy is so much more essential to these kinds of enterprises than numbers. Everything in the plan exists to protect surprise. The 14-mile march over goat tracks instead of roads. The order to detain every civilian who might carry a warning. Telling the enlisted men their target only at the last possible hour. And above all, the unloaded muskets, a measure whose entire purpose was to make it physically impossible for surprise to be thrown away by one frightened man's trigger finger. Strip surprise out of Stony Point, and you have 1,300 men dying on an abattis. Keep it, and you have 1,300 men inside the walls before the garrison understands what is happening. Surprise was not a part of the plan. Surprise was the plan, and everything else was scaffolding to hold it up. The second principle is economy of force, expressed through the feint. Murphy's center column is the most elegant idea on the field. Wayne took his smallest force, gave it the one job that required noise instead of silence, and spent it loudly and deliberately to buy the success of the 2 columns that mattered. Those few hundred loaded muskets at the causeway did more damage to the British than the 1,000 bayonets on the cliffs. Not by killing, but by lying convincingly enough to reach inside the enemy commander's head and steer his decisions. Murphy's men did not break the British line. They made the British line break itself by drawing Johnson's reserves to exactly the wrong place. That is economy of force at its purest. A small price, paid in the right currency, that unlocks a vastly larger result. The third principle is combined arms and synchronization. This was not a mob rushing a wall. It was a machine of interdependent parts, each useless without the others, all timed to act at once. The forlorn hopes to absorb the first fire, the axemen behind them to open the abatis, the main columns behind them to pour through, the northern and southern assaults striking simultaneously, so the garrison could not face either, the loud feint in the center binding it all together. The real test of such a plan is not whether it works on paper, but whether it survives contact with chaos. And Stony Point's machine kept running even after the sentry's shot tore away the surprise, even after the marsh flooded deeper than expected, even after the commanding general went down with a ball in his skull. A plan that survives all three of those shocks and still wins in under half an hour is a plan worth studying for 2 centuries. The fourth principle is using terrain to cancel firepower. The British had 15 heavy guns, and in the decisive minutes, those guns were nearly worthless. Not because they were silenced, but because the Americans attacked up ground the guns could not be aimed at. By swarming up the steepest slopes, into the dead space beneath the downward arc of the cannon, the light infantry made the fortress's greatest strength irrelevant through pure geometry. And the axis of the whole attack, the flooded southern marsh, the strip of beach McLean confirmed at low tide, was chosen precisely because it was the one approach the defenses did not truly cover. The lesson is permanent, and it echoes through every later war. A defender's firepower only counts where it can reach. Attack where it cannot, and the biggest guns in the world become so much dead iron. The fifth principle is the hardest of all, and the one no manual can fully teach. Psychological discipline as a weapon. Empty muskets are only a tactic if the men can be trusted to keep them empty under fire. And these men did, through a freezing swamp, up a defended cliff, into a hand-to-hand fight, with their general bleeding among them. The white paper on the hats, the forbidden watchword, the standing order to kill any man who broke the silence. All of it was machinery for manufacturing a discipline so total that it became, itself, the cutting edge of the assault. And the same discipline that drove the bayonet uphill is what sheathed it the instant the British surrendered. Control going in, control coming out. That is the rarest thing on any battlefield, and it is the real reason Stony Point endures in the study of war. Not as a tale of fury, but as a study in the terrifying power of men who have mastered themselves. This is the template that armies have chased ever since. The silent night raid, the small elite force, surprise multiplied by discipline, terrain turned against the defender, a feint to misdirect the mind of the man in command. It is the ancestor of the modern special operations doctrine, and it was assembled whole on one rock in the Hudson in 1/2 hour of darkness in 1779. Here is something strange and revealing. The midnight bayonet charge at Stony Point was, by any honest measure, one of the most dramatic operations of the entire Revolution. And yet, almost immediately, Americans began to make things up about it. The 19th century buried the real battle under a thick layer of romantic invention. Slaughtered dogs, heroic guides, screamed battle cries, gigantic swords. To understand the battle, you have to peel those inventions back off, one by one, and ask why people felt the need to add them at all. Start with the dogs. One of the most persistent legends, set down in 1850 by the popular historian Benson Lossing, claims that Wayne's soldiers crept through the countryside on the way to Stony Point quietly bayoneting every dog they passed, so that no barking could alert the garrison. It is a vivid, grim, memorable image. It is also almost certainly nonsense. Period maps show that the country between Fort Montgomery and Stony Point was sparsely populated. There were no great packs of dogs to slaughter. And the practical reality is the opposite of the legend. Chasing down agile dogs in pitch darkness and silently bayoneting them is very nearly impossible, and the squeals of wounded animals would have raised far more alarm than ordinary barking ever could. The real order Wayne issued was the prosaic one we already know. Detain all the male civilians along the route. The dog story appears to trace back to hearsay jotted in the diary of a Royal Navy Commodore who was not even present at the battle. A real precaution about people became a colorful fable about animals. Then there is the myth of Pompey Lamb. The story goes that a local enslaved man named Pompey Lamb, who sold strawberries to the British garrison and had learned their countersign, secretly guided Wayne's columns to the fort and personally gagged the first British sentry to open the way. It is a touching, dramatic detail, and it has been retold many times. But it does not survive contact with the records. No contemporary military dispatch, no diary, no scrap of court-martial testimony from either the British or the American side mentions anyone matching Lamb's description guiding the army. The navigation of that 14-mile night march was done by Continental officers, using intelligence gathered by trained professionals like Captain Alan McLean. The Pompey Lamb story is a later addition, attached to a battle that already had a real and brilliant intelligence operation at its heart. It just happened to be one carried out by a spy in a farmer's disguise rather than a strawberry seller in the dark. Then there is the most emotionally satisfying myth of all, and the one the truth most directly contradicts. Folklore insists that as the Americans surged up the cliffs, they screamed, "Remember Paoli," a vengeance cry hurled at the men whose army had massacred their comrades 2 years before. It is perfect. It is exactly what the story seems to demand. And it is, almost certainly, an invention. The most thorough modern study of the battle finds no witness on either side, American or British, who reported hearing it. Absolute silence was the whole doctrine, maintained until the inner works were breached. That was the whole doctrine, the thing men would have been killed for breaking. We even have it from the other side. During Johnson's court-martial, the British officers who testified explained that in the chaos and darkness, they identified the attacking troops by their uniforms and by the direction of the musketry. And not one of them ever mentioned hearing Americans shout, "Remember Paoli." The only cry that night was the officially designated watchword, and only after the walls were taken. The fort's our own. The vengeance of Paoli was real, but it lived in the silence and the steel, not in a shout. The legend gave it a voice because the truth, that they answered a massacre without a single word, was somehow too disciplined, too cold for the storytellers to leave alone. And there is a deeper layer beneath even that. Wayne was never actually ordered to take Stony Point as revenge for Paoli. The assignment was strategic, not personal. The vengeance was something later tellers supplied because the symmetry, a Paoli survivor storming a fort by silent bayonet in the dark, was simply too good to leave on the table. There is even a fabricated conversation. A famous apocryphal exchange has Wayne boasting to Washington, "General, if you only plan it, I'll storm hell." To which Washington supposedly replied with cool wit, "Perhaps we had better try Stony Point first." It is a wonderful line, the kind of thing that belongs on a statue's plinth. It also never happened. It was first offered up as tradition by the 19th century author Washington Irving. the same imagination that gave America the headless horseman. And it has no foundation whatsoever in the actual, highly secretive correspondence between the two generals. And finally, the case of Peter Francisco shows how a legend grows on top of a real soldier. In later pension applications and folklore, Francisco swelled into the second man into the fort, wielding a 5-foot broadsword ordered for him personally by Washington, cutting down redcoats in a duel at the flagstaff and tearing down the colors with his own hands. What the records actually support is narrower, and it is still plenty. The muster rolls confirm he was in the light infantry. He testified that he served in a forlorn hope, and his own pension applications describe the 9-inch bayonet wound he carried off that rock. The flourishes are another matter. Wayne credited de Fleury with striking the colors. The reports written by Wayne and by Febiguer name Lieutenant George Knox, not Francisco, as the second man into the works. And of the 6 surviving accounts left by American officers from Francisco's own column, together with the recollections of the British defenders, not one mentions him, or any giant carving his way to the flagstaff. His real ordeal, climbing that slope and fighting on with his abdomen laid open, needed no broadsword. The legend handed him one anyway. Why does all of this matter? Because the pattern of the myths tells you what the storytellers thought the true story lacked. They added a vivid atrocity, the dogs, a sympathetic guide, lamb, a thunderous battle cry, remember Paoli, a witty quotation, storm hell, and a single titanic hero, Francisco's broadsword. And in doing so, they revealed that they did not trust the real thing to carry the weight. But the real thing is more frightening than any of it. The truth is hundreds of men wading chest deep through black water with empty guns, climbing a cliff in total silence under orders to be killed by their own officers if they made a sound, taking a fortress full of artillery with nothing but the bayonet, and then having every reason and every opportunity for slaughter, stopping the moment the enemy begged for mercy. You do not need slaughtered dogs and screamed vengeance to make that frightening. The silence was the terror. The discipline was the legend. The truth was always enough. The Battle of Stony Point holds a strange place in the history of the Revolution, because by one measure, it accomplished almost nothing. The Americans held the ground for less than 3 days before walking away from it, and the British were back among the ruins within a week. If you judge a battle purely by the territory it permanently changed hands, Stony Point barely registers. No border moved. No city fell for good. And yet, its real effects ran far deeper than any patch of ground, because what Stony Point changed was not the map. It was the mind. Start with the immediate strategic consequences, which were severe. The assault arrested Sir Henry Clinton's entire Hudson River offensive in its tracks. It removed, at a stroke, the immediate threat to West Point, the keystone of the American position in the north. And it forced the British onto the defensive in the northern theater for the rest of the war. Clinton's October decision to abandon the whole King's Ferry line was the direct admission of a campaign that had failed. A single half-hour operation, conducted by fewer than 1,400 men who then gave back what they took, had derailed the summer plans of a global empire. But the deepest legacy was a transformation in what the Continental Army was understood to be. Before 1779, the settled belief among European commanders, and it was a belief the British High Command held with real confidence, was that American troops were, at bottom, irregulars. They could skirmish. They could shoot from behind cover, from walls and trees, in the loose frontier style. But put them in a formal, close quarters, bayonet-to-bayonet fight against British regulars in the open, and they would break every time. That assumption shaped how the British fought the entire war. Stony Point obliterated it. Here was a hand-picked American corps executing a complex, precisely synchronized night assault. Multiple columns, a coordinated feint, a flooded approach, walls of timber, over terrain that should have been impossible. With unloaded muskets, relying on nothing but cold steel and discipline, and doing it better than the British regulars they were attacking. The men who could supposedly only fight from behind a wall had just stormed a fortress in the dark without firing a shot. The narrative was dead. After Stony Point, no serious officer could claim the Americans could not stand at the point of the bayonet. And that is where the story reaches forward and touches the end of the war itself. Because the tactical blueprint forged on that rock did not stay on that rock. Absolute stealth, unloaded muskets, total reliance on the bayonet, synchronized columns striking in the dark. It became a proven, trusted doctrine for Continental shock troops, a thing the Army now knew it could do, because it had done it. 2 years later, in October of 1781, George Washington reached for that exact template again, at the moment it mattered most. At the siege of Yorktown, the British defensive line hinged on a strong point called Redoubt No. 10. Washington ordered the light infantry forward to take it, under the cover of darkness, with unloaded muskets, with the bayonet. The man who led that charge was Alexander Hamilton. And it worked, exactly as it had worked on the Hudson. A silent, ferocious, cold steel assault in the dark overran the redoubt, collapsed the British defensive line at Yorktown, and helped force the surrender of Lord Cornwallis and his army. The surrender that effectively ended the war and secured American independence. Trace the line, then. The bayonets that flashed in the dark over the marshes of Stony Point in July of 1779 are the same bayonets, the same doctrine, the same discipline, that 2 years later carried Redoubt No. 10 and broke the British at Yorktown. The midnight charge that humiliated the British Empire on a rock in the Hudson was the rehearsal for the charge that ended the Empire's war in America. So what does Stony Point finally teach? 15 and more decades on. It teaches that numbers and fortifications and firepower are not destiny. The British counted 15 guns, 2 rings of earthworks, warships, 600 regulars, and a rock surrounded by water. And they concluded, reasonably by every rule they knew, that the place could not be taken. They were counting the wrong things. They did not count surprise. They did not count discipline so absolute that men would cross a freezing marsh with empty guns rather than risk one sound. They did not count a commander whose memory of a massacre had made him a master of the very weapon that had wounded him. And they did not count the simplest, oldest truth of war, that the side which decides where and how and when the fight will happen can make all the enemy's strength irrelevant. Henry Johnson did everything his training told him to do, and he lost everything, because the Americans had changed the rules in the dark. That is the warning Stony Point leaves for every confident, well-armed, well-fortified power that has ever looked at a weaker enemy and assumed the math was settled. The math is never settled. It only waits for someone disciplined enough and silent enough and willing enough to give up the gun, to rewrite it. They came across the water with muskets they were forbidden to fire. They climbed the rock without a sound. They answered a massacre with a blade, and then, at the last moment, with mercy. And in less than half an hour of darkness, a few hundred men who were supposed to be incapable of standing against British regulars took the fortress the British Empire said could not be taken, and proved, with cold steel and total silence, that they were not rebels who could only hide behind walls. They were soldiers. They were dangerous. And they were determined to be free. The fort was their own. And so, in the end, was the country.